Panel number 2, Biomedical Perdurance and Alternative Lives. And we only have 2 panelists for this one. Our first panelist will be Ione Abora. She's a postdoctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania.
Doctor student.
Postdoctoral fellow. Her title of her presentation is Opting Out, Nigerian Students in Self-Destruction as a Mode of Maneuver. And our second presenter is online. Her name is Magdalena Zagara Kiapori, University of Cambridge. And her title of her presentation is Remaining, Vital Acts and Possibility, the Exercise of Sustaining Oneself in a Residential Care Center for Older Adults in Lima, Peru. So we will begin with Ione.
Do I control the You can control it if you like.
I do have a bit of housekeeping as well. Somebody left this? No, somebody? Okay.
I hope you guys don't mind if I stand, it's just easy. So good morning and thank you for attending this panel. My name is Dr. Ione Abora and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Africana Studies here at Penn. I will be presenting, which one do I, this one? This. Okay, I will be presenting my paper titled Opting Out, Nigerian Students and Self-Destruction as a Mode of Maneuver. I will make 2 core arguments. Firstly, opting out of productivity through self-harm, suicidal ideation, and indeed suicide can be viewed as legitimate ways to circumvent uncertainty. And secondly, external markers of resilience should not be mistaken for an emotionally healthy interior world. I will first briefly present my PhD research, where the data for this paper comes from. After this, I will discuss self-harm as a way in which Nigerian students opt out of uncertainty. Following this, I will discuss suicide as a way in which they lean out of uncertainty. Then I will offer an Africanic interpretation of these 2 modes of maneuver. And then to conclude, I will just kind of give a question of the relevance of this, not just to Africa and Nigeria, but to the wider world. So the data for this paper comes from my PhD thesis, in which I investigated how Nigerian university students and recent graduates understand and react to uncertainty. Using a combination of timeline interviews, solicited journals, and background surveys, I collected the narratives of 26 Nigerian students and recent graduates. The students were either from and or studied in northern Nigeria or Abuja. I chose to focus on Nigerian students and recent graduates because much of the discourse attributes the advent of African uncertainty to the mid-1980s. This is when neoliberal structural adjustment programs were implemented in Africa, with Nigeria implementing them in 1986. Most current students and recent graduates were either A, young children during the inception of this uncertainty, B, born during the advent of this uncertainty, or C, born into the new world that this uncertainty created. Therefore, they can be viewed as generation uncertainty. And the demographics of my sample can be found on the slide behind me. The thesis argued that the scholarly emphasis on the productive nature of uncertainty is emblematic of a focus on resilience that reinforces neoliberal ideas about the individual. Across the myriad of emotional responses that they have to uncertainty and that were discussed in the thesis, 2 kept coming up across all themes: their propensity to self-harm and suicidal ideation. Not to tease you, the audience, but before we get into the implications and analysis of these responses, I must briefly explain how resilience is typically discussed in relation to uncertainty. Okay, so research on African uncertainties has tended to foreground productivity within uncertainty and marginalize the emotional response to uncertainty. I want to stress here that I'm not trying to say that they do not acknowledge emotion, but rather that they foreground and emphasize the productive value of uncertainty. Indeed, some of the scholarship even frames the productive value of uncertainty as a positive attribute or byproduct of uncertainty. The foregrounding of productivity, as well as the positive framing of it, can be viewed as emblematic of an ideology of neoliberal resilience. Within the neoliberal conceptualization of resilience, the ability to be productive within uncertain or fraught situations is valorized. The individual is expected to fashion themselves as the entrepreneurial self, in charge alone of managing the outcomes of their lives. Additionally, the marginalization of the emotional responses to uncertainty can be seen as the perpetuation of colonial beliefs about the Black body. Colonial understandings of Africans were filled with tropes connoting Blackness with strength. There was the expectation that the Black body could survive both mental and physical anguish, as evidenced by the quote behind me from Sojourner Truth. This belief still echoes in Africanist discourses. We valorize the resilient African, investigating the tactics they use to survive and thrive within uncertainty, and neglect to fully consider the emotional repercussions of uncertainty. This pedestaling of resilience is not limited to scholastic discussions on uncertainty. My respondents were deeply aware of the fact that they had to be resilient. They were socialized to be resilient, and they frequently emphasized that no sympathy or empathy would be offered to them if they crumbled under the weight of their uncertainties. Kevin Clay has termed this expectation Black resilience neoliberalism. He says, it is the normalization and valorization of exercising human capital in relation to overcoming or enduring, both of which obscures or ignores Black suffering. It normalizes Black folk having to overcome deeply entrenched systems and structures with endurance, savvy, and austerity. It also valorizes individuated Black success. Inversely, it is visible in the condemnation of Black folks and Black communities who cannot rise above to defeat the odds. In the face of this demand, the students acted resiliently. They pursue higher education. When they face educational disruption, displacement, financial uncertainty, amongst many other uncertainties, they bounce back. They hustle for opportunity. Describing this resilient disposition, one of my interlocutors, Trent, said, Nigerians, we always move on. One of our greatest undoings as Nigerians is our resilience. We can endure things, something terrible happens, and Nigerians will just leave it with God. There has been no limit to how far we can be stretched. Christina, another one of my interlocutors, admits that psychologically, it takes a special grace for you to remain sane. All of their narratives embody this neoliberal principle of resilience, that even if you're stretched to your limits, you can and should recover. The problem that the students find, however, is that despite their resilience, they are unable to escape their emotions. And oftentimes they cannot see a way to exit their uncertainties. So they turn to self-harm and suicidal ideation. Tactic one, and I have an Afrobeats lyric on the slide that I think embodies this spirit of what I'll be talking about in this tactic. Self-harm escapism. Many of the students described how they harmed themselves in order to escape their uncertainties. Suicidal ideation and self-harm can be viewed as outlaw emotions. Alison Jager defines outlaw emotions as emotions that don't fall within the scope of the cultural value system. She argues that people who most typically feel outlaw emotions are those who are disenfranchised, minoritized, or made precarious. Within Nigeria, resilience or emotional stoicism is the prevailing emotional value. This is the result of colonialism, slavery, and post-colonial subordination, and has been further reinforced by the neoliberalization of Nigeria in the 1980s. The prevailing value is to not emote emotions despite the immense emotional weight Black people and Africans carry. Therefore, the experience of negative emotion can be viewed as an outlaw emotion. I will now describe two very different situations of self-harm that nevertheless have the same motivational force behind them. One of the many frustrations plaguing Nigerian youth is economic uncertainty. The general unemployment rate is 33%, and 43% of the youth population is unemployed. During both colonialism and the post-independence era, education had been viewed as a pathway to employment. There is an enduring belief, both from the parents and the students, that the social contract that rewards educational efforts and achievement with employment still endures. However, the underfunding of the Nigerian education system because of neoliberal ideological reasons has had a severe impact on the quality of education students receive and the quality of graduates universities produce. Of the Nigerians who have completed tertiary education, 41.2% of those working are not working in wage jobs. Speaking more broadly about the economy, the cost of living for most Nigerians is about 3.5 times more than the average salary, and the inflation rate at the time was 15.9%. For anyone wondering, it is now 24.48%. This economic landscape engenders ontological insecurity in the students. They cannot forecast the future or what to do in the face of this uncertainty. Young people may feel marginalized and precarious within the society. James, 26 at the time, says, Nigeria does not allow a young person to reach his full potential. He turns to substance abuse to cope with his growing sense of economic and financial uncertainty. He says, I feel bad. I try to get my mind off it, so I wouldn't dwell so much on it because I'm an overthinker. So when I feel bad, I just drink, try to get high for the moment, so I should feel better, drink and get high. James was working very hard to escape his uncertainties. He was actively trying to apply to universities in the West for graduate studies. On face value, he's an exemplary picture of resilience. He consistently strives, plans, and networks to reach the life he wants for himself. However, it is not tenable to consistently be resilient. James's narrative highlights this. His substance abuse shows his fatigue. Through substance abuse, he seeks temporary escape from his uncertainties. When he is high, he doesn't have to ruminate. His ability to work is suspended. Their uncertainties and ensuing emotions do not only stem from structural causes, they also stem from the nuances and intricacies of their culture. Odette resorts to self-harm because of what I have termed the hierarchy of age in Nigeria. She described how her friend ran away from home because she felt mistreated by her father, and how the friend's father, the school officials, and lawyers colluded to make her take responsibility for it, and threatened her that she was not allowed to tell her family about this. The blame for her friend's disappearance lies with her friend's father. But instead of accepting this, her friend's father uses his age as a shield from culpability and blame. Odette's school does not know that the father is to blame because they invested in the idea that Odette owes her friend's father respect and do not give Odette the platform to defend herself. They constantly pull her out of her classes at the whims of her friend's father and his lawyers, to the extent that she does not feel that she will be able to take and pass her final exams. She does not believe that she can advocate for herself, and she sees no pathway forward that can help her achieve the results she wants to be able to go to school. Describing this, she narrates, I lost sleep. I couldn't just sleep because I was always thinking. My heart was always palpitating, and I was contemplating suicide at that point because I was in hell. I was dying emotionally, and I contemplated harming myself. So I had a lot of emotions I call physical harm. We see this repeated idea in both James's and Odette's narrative that they are trapped by their uncertainties. They do not truly understand how to move forward, so they turn towards self-harm. Odette's desire to harm herself and her suicidal ideation are both instances of her turning towards outlaw emotions. This underscores her feeling of disenfranchisement as a young woman in Nigeria. She does not feel that the value system considers or protects her, but rather is the progenitor of her uncertainties. Tactic 2, suicide/exiting. This leads us perfectly into tactic 2, suicidal ideation. This feeling of being trapped and resultantly turning towards an outlaw emotion can be viewed through the prism of Durkheim's theory on suicide. In his treatise, he creates 4 categories of suicide: egotistic, altruistic, anonymous, and fatalistic. Odette's suicidal ideation falls into the 4th category. Durkheim, defining this form of suicide, explains it is a suicide deriving from excessive regulation, that a person with futures pitilessly blocked and passion violently choked by oppressive discipline. All suicides attributable to excessive physical or moral despotism, to bring out the ineluctable and the inflexible nature of a rule against which there is no appeal. Odette feels that she is trapped in a system of moral despotism, hierarchy of age, in which she doesn't have a way to escape. So suicidal ideation becomes a way in which she can instrumentalize her agency. This idea of suicide, when the person perceives that there are no possibilities of resilience or is exhausted by resilience, is also seen in Wanda, another one of my students' behavior during the pandemic. Wanda felt that there was no way that life would ever return to normal, that the pandemic had finally shown the limitations of how she could maneuver to live the life she wanted. So she suffered from suicidal ideation. She wants to migrate from uncertainty, and since she feels like there is no earthly escape, she considers fatalistic suicide. Stephen Stack, speaking about fatalistic suicide, argues that it is related to the degree of political totalitarianism or overregulation in society. He says that we have to see banning of political parties, arrest or exile of opposition politicians, declarations of martial law, instating of a curfew, closing down of newspapers and other elements of mass media for the purpose of censorship or over control, and finally, the mobilizing of troops for domestic consequences. During this time period, Nigeria can be said to be fulfilling all these conditions. The National Broadcasting Company had fined media for reporting on the #EndSARS protests that took place during the pandemic. The media had also been instructed to downplay the Nigerian security situation, and journalists were being arrested for reporting on and investigating the pandemic. Additionally, Twitter was banned for 7 months commencing in June 2021. We see the instating of a curfew. Nigeria, alongside many countries, instated a curfew. This curfew was at times violently enforced. This curfew lasted until April 2022. So we see the mobilizing of troops for domestic consequences. Finally, we witnessed the violent ways in which the army shot, treated, and arrested the protesters in that case. This expansive temporality of the pandemic, not knowing when it will end, the uniqueness of the pandemic as an event, all created uncertainty for Wanda. This uncertainty combined with conditions of overregulation and led her to consider fatalistic suicide. She was at the end of her resilience. So Africanizing this, I know that I said that these are all outlier emotions. However, Africanizing this, I posit that these examples are all maladaptive forms of Japa. The word Japa is Yoruba in origin and is comprised of 2 words, Ja, to break loose, and Pa refers to the intensity or severity of an action. When Ja and Pa are combined, it makes the word Japa and means to run, to flee, to escape. Japa has become synonymous with Nigerians leaving the country in the face of uncertainties. Nigerians have always emigrated in the face of uncertainty. Indeed, Africans have a long history of migration to both escape uncertainty as well as both the uncertainties of their families and social networks in their home countries. These students are still choosing to migrate when they choose self-harm or suicide. Amy Chandler has highlighted how self-harm and suicide can be used to exert agency. She says that suicide or self-harm implicates a body that may be stopped in some ways, but is nonetheless one that still does. They may be stopped from acting in the culturally and societally acceptable ways, but through suicidal ideation and self-harm, they find an alternative pathway to navigate from their uncertainties, migrating both inward into the interiority of themselves as well as contemplating exiting life. It is a maladaptive aberration of a commonly used Nigerian tactic to deal with uncertainty. And finally, just to conclude, and I'm not going to say too much on this because Wale beat me to the punch in his opening remarks this morning. I think we can see, when we look at things like structural adjustment programs, this is just the earlier forms of what we're now seeing in the global north through austerity programs. And so we should really look at the emotional landscapes of these students as almost emotional canaries in the coal mine for the future of the youth in the global north, when they too find that under these programs, there's no way to act resiliently or that they are linked to their resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will have Magdalena present.
Yes, hello. How are you? Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to present my paper. Are my slides available?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let me see. Give me a moment, please. Yeah, I want to start with the slides.
One moment. We're pulling them up.
Okay, great, perfect. Okay, so my paper is titled Remaining Vital Acts and Possibility, the exercise of sustaining oneself in a residential care center for older adults in Lima, Peru. Next slide, please. So how does one cope with old age in a total institution when everything that anchors one to life has been lost? What possibilities do people have of remaining engaged in living when their lives are tremendously constrained by the structures of a world that places them on the margins? In this paper, I explore how older adults residing in La Merced Shelter, which is an institution for the abandoned elderly in Lima, Peru, struggle to achieve well-being despite living within a facility that annuls them socially. Faced with difficulties of an institutional life, a life that involves family abandonment, a lack of affection, or inhabiting a deteriorating infrastructure, these men and women not only resist, but they overcome, they endure, or find some way to cope with adversity, even though the alternatives for a different life in the shelter are very few. This presentation offers an examination of the ways in which residents of La Merced rework their precarious life circumstances and still take refuge in life, precisely by adapting to the limits that constitute the conditions of their worlds. I argue that it is not through grandiloquent and extraordinary acts, but rather in the quotidian that individuals maneuver their restricting social conditions and find the possibility for different life circumstances to emerge. People at the shelter find a way to inhabit possibility through the performance of what I have called vital acts. Vital acts are coping strategies that help older adults unearth new paths at the interstices of their precarious conditions. Despite taking place in the ordinary, vital acts offer these women and men the chance to live beyond what is given to them and to bear the unbearable with a timid glimpse of hope. Next slide, please. So, growing old in La Merced shelter. In Lima, there are approximately 46 accredited early residential care centers by the Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Populations. La Merced shelter is only one of them. Lacking the financial resources to provide appropriate care to its residents, La Merced shelter is a dilapidated facility, as you can see in the pictures, where people socially vanish as a result of severe kin ties and inadequate institutional assistance. People come to La Merced for various reasons. Some cannot financially support themselves in old age, lacking the health, employment, or pension that provides them financial security. Others do not have social networks and lack someone who can care for them. In some cases, people come to La Merced because they have lost everything, and they see La Merced as a refuge from living on the street. Dilapidated furniture, peeled walls, cracked and urinated floors, this broken down infrastructure constitutes La Merced as a deteriorated landscape, a precarious topography. At La Merced, destitution, oblivion, and postponement weigh heavily on people's everyday lives. The precarity that pervades this decrepit institution is precisely a reflection of how macrostructural constraints shape the intimate life force of the marginal elderly in a city such as Lima. Pierced by incertitude and suspended time, the lives of those who dwell on this dilapidated geography hinges on doubt. Such doubt arises from material brokenness that also destroys subjective worlds and inner affective lives. Uncertainty and a rumbling instability, a terrain muddied in Allison's terms, is a dramatic context where those who lack family networks, care, and economic security are endlessly embracing new tactics of endurance and resistance as they grow old. I ask, what are the limitations and possibilities of remaining intelligible actors at the end of life in an environment of perpetual loss, destitution, and abandonment? How do people give sense to their last days of existence and endure life in such an inhospitable place? Next slide, please. My contention is that residents of this institution sustain themselves in the world and continue to cling to life by performing vital acts. I have developed the concept of vital act to refer to those personal strategies that older adults deploy in La Merced in order to recover, rebuild, and rework their life and their everyday. Trivial at first sight, it is through such vital acts that people on the margins execute personal agency and resist social and institutional arrangements that limit them in their quest for well-being and quality of life. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about vital acts. During the first months of my ethnographic project, I befriended a man called Ricardo. One of Ricardo's main projects was creating a production chain for different objects among the self-sufficient residents. These individuals will get together in the occupational therapy room and engage in various handicrafts, which they could then sell to people beyond the institution, such as necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. For Ricardo, the project's success would be marked by creating a community of residents working as a team, whose profit would be used to improve the services offered to them at the shelter. But the likelihood of living better was inexorably tied to the institution's regulations. On their way towards undertaking this possible project, Ricardo and his potential companions found themselves under the strict protocols of an absolute institutional vertical system that drastically sanctioned alternative ways of living beyond what was stipulated by internal regulations. Here, Elizabeth Paulinelli's ideas regarding possibility are pertinent. In prohibiting residents from working and selling the things they made, La Merced was, quote, determining what would and would not be possible within an alternative social world, end of quote. The institution would never allow residents to work within its walls. As many staff members explained to me, this would provoke a scandal, discrediting La Merced in the eyes of the public. Ricardo's project then was unworkable. Was there still for him any sense in persevering any kind of hope in an alternative world? For Ricardo, resignation was not an option. If selling handicrafts could not be a communal enterprise, he would turn it then into his personal project. Ricardo resolved to secretly associate with a volunteer that came to the shelter on the weekends. He gave the young man some money to buy beads. The volunteer brought back the beads to Ricardo, and he manually fabricated necklaces and bracelets, which the volunteer sold outside of La Merced. On the next occasion they met, the volunteer gave Ricardo the earnings while keeping a tiny percentage. With this new income, Ricardo provided for himself basic goods that the institution could not offer him, including marmalade, detergent, and some medicines. It should be noted that the act of making necklaces by hand was not only an economic project for Ricardo. For him, this project actually represented a restorative act of his humanity. He said to me once, "This is a way of life for me, a means of personal development. It allows me to have an income, but not only that, it also means feeling alive. When I make necklaces, I create something. I am still useful. For me, making my necklaces means being able to continue being a person, to create. Making necklaces for me is an act of will. The way I see it, the people here are dead, living dead. I don't want to be one of the living dead. I want to be alive. I want to die alive, and this activity brings me back to life." For Ricardo, making necklaces implies the possibility of continuing to feel that his life has a purpose. Despite being old and weakened, he can still be productive and socially valuable. The making and selling of these objects are about the opportunity for transcendence, of being an individual with meaning, with a life project. This is a vital act for him. Not having that is equivalent to ceasing to possess the quality of personhood, to becoming an object without agency. For Ricardo, the main thing is not to be absent from the world, but instead to connect with life through restorative acts that help him mitigate the abandonment in which he lives. Next slide, please. Ricardo's story is not the only one that shows how some residents of La Merced managed to remain in the institution. Like Ricardo, Jaime also managed to sustain himself in La Merced, despite his last days seeming impossible. He was 68, a smoker and slim, a former firefighter. His love life had been unsuccessful and continued to be an open wound. He used to tell me, "It is sad for me to think that I am going to die without having felt that someone loved me." Months went by fast at the institution, and I noticed that Jaime had an unusual habit of helping others, especially those bedridden and in wheelchairs. Even though he was aging broken-hearted, Jaime showed solidarity with others. His generosity and empathy caught my attention and pushed me to know him a little more. One day, he confessed to me that by helping others, he was feeling his yearning for human affection, something he felt life had deprived him of. He said to me, "It is very good for me to help because I feel relief of my own frustration. It makes me feel realized. It's like a therapy for me. I feel a sense of relief, especially from my frustration, my great pain, right? Not to have found a person who loves me the way I want. Perhaps I feel relief in that regard. You see, I feel the absence of affection so much that I immediately offer it to other people." I asked Jaime if helping others was maybe a way of doing something for himself as well. "Of course it is," he responded. "Making life bearable for others, for other people, make it bearable for me. To give the affection that I don't receive, I offer it, so that others do not feel my sadness, my pain. It is a way of expressing your love. That's how I find the solution, giving affection to other people. There is something about Jaime's word that for me resonates with the famous maxim Jacques Lacan formulated in his fifth seminar. Quote, to love is to give to someone who has or doesn't have what is in question, but it's certainly to give what one doesn't have. When asked about what psychoanalysis can teach us about love, psychoanalyst Jacques Alain Miller, in a 2008 interview, outlined the following interpretation of Lacan's statement. He said, to love is to recognize your lack and give it to the other, place it in the other. It's not giving what you possess, it's giving something else that you don't possess, which goes beyond you. To do that, you have to assume your lack, your castration, as Freud used to say. Lack and castration, in the words of Miller, frustration and great pain, in Jaime's terms. His subjectivity is cut through with a lack of affection. The lack is irrecoverable unless the vital act is performed, showing solidarity with others. Jaime gives from his lack and healed wound the affection that has eluded him his whole life. Experiencing affection primarily by giving it is Jaime's path to carry on through the desolation of growing old in a precarious institutions. In Jaime's case, it is not a question of I think, therefore I am. On the contrary, his guiding premise would appear to be I give, therefore I am. Through the act of giving, Jaime restructures his affective world. It is only through his vital act that in his present, Jaime finds a purpose in La Merced. By giving his solidarity to those who need it, Jaime can restore his wrecked subjectivity. Before I filled the emptiness with liquor, he told me once. Now I fill it by helping. Next slide, please. So now we reach the conclusions. And I want to say that the vital acts are the ontological terrain where the transforming event of becoming occurs. These older adults find the path even in the rings of devastation. They carry on with anger, with despair or optimism, with resignation or with hope, but they carry on nevertheless. In other words, the ways into which desire cracks rigid social fields can be marginal, humble, or minor. Still, for La Merced residents, it is a journey towards possibility even amid social postponement, inefficient care systems, and an economic governability that sees them as disposable. These people remain, above all, anchored in life and permeable to others, as finding possibility for them entails surviving, enduring, and living beyond a world order that assigns to them the status of the marginal, the decrepit, the wasted, and the unproductive. Older adults at this institution not only cope with daunting circumstances, with living on the margins, with inhabiting social and material terrains of misery, they find ways to live moral and decent lives amid all of this, amidst an environment of visceral despair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank both presenters. I'll begin with a question for both of you. So our keynote, Abdul Malik, he talked about the global South, not as a geography, but as a political ontology. And in that, he also examined this concept of vernacular resilience. And I think Leonardo as well talked about vernacular resilience. But that implies communal, and I think Leonardo and Anderson talked about focus on communities, ability to resist. You all are focusing on individual acts, I believe. So my concern is, not even concern, my question is, in what ways are the individual acts of agency that you describe connected to larger communities, if they are, and if not, is that connectivity needed to have an effective form of agency?
Yes, well, so the individual acts that I describe are actually not connected to a bigger, wider panorama, as you mentioned, because the elderly people who live in this shelter were mostly isolated from society. So they lived there and they were many times not allowed to leave the facility. Many times they didn't receive visits from their families. So these are individual acts that they can perform in this specific social setting, in this institutionalized setting, but it's not, the institution didn't allow the people to go out to the outside world, to connect to different activities, to other ways of being, to other social structures, to other social dynamics, etc. I wanted to ask you, what was the second part of your question, please?
Well, my question is that type of connection to larger communities, do you think is needed to have a more effective form of agency?
Um,
So to be more clear,
yes.
so to get the institution, so this whole idea of vernacular resilience is to reclaim space, is to claim your own space. So is this forcing the institution, is the agency you described, is it forcing the institution to change their behavior at all?
No, actually, the institution was very negligent towards the attitudes, or the desires and the will and the needs of the people that were living there. As I have shown in some of the pictures, the institution was a totally precarious place that did not guarantee care and security for its residents. On the contrary, it mostly promoted mistreatment, harm, and danger. So I would say that no, that the institution did not do this.
So, I mean, I do, of course, I think community is really needed, but I think what needed, but I think the thing with neoliberalism is that it disrupts community, right? And it disrupts like the idea of like collective societal solidarity, right? So these individuals, my interlocutors, they have this immense sense of self-responsibility that, you know, they are in charge of their lives and that they have to rely solely on themselves, you know. And I think that, I mean, what we do see, of course, there are examples that I referenced, you know, Lekki, I think the protests at Lekki were like, you know, a sign of like collective and communal action. But I think that the prevailing idea is that they don't have that collective to fall back on, that they don't have that community to fall back on, that they have to rely on themselves. And in fact, even in instances where they are embedded within their community, the community's expectations is that they will work hard, they will study hard, they will manage their emotions, they will persevere as an individual to be successful, to make the community proud, but maybe the community isn't necessarily going to expect that they should do that work.
Okay, we will open it up to questions. Other questions?
Yeah, great. Great. Well, yeah, hi, I'm still Franco Barchisi from Ohio State. My question is for Ione. How bad is my pronunciation?
It's, you know what, I have heard every variation of my name, so like, I'm not even bothered by pronunciation at this point.
I mean, like
Ione.
Ione. Yes, I found your analysis of suicide, and I think the word you connected to suicide was exit.
Yes.
Suicide is a form of exit, very powerful, especially because if one connects it to your opening quote from Sojourner Truth, and that connection, of course, evokes a whole tradition of Black critical reasoning on suicide as a practice, even a strategy, in fact. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, I don't know, Huey Newton when he writes, you know, the Black Revolutionary. The Black Revolutionary cannot think about the future because the Black Revolutionary in the future will be dead. But that's not a way of giving up for Newton. That's a way of, as he writes, give yourself entirely to the now. So suicide is not merely nihilistic, or if there is a nihilistic component, that component is framed in an affirmative way. It's an affirmative type of negation, so to speak. And Durkheim didn't like that, but Durkheim was more interested in what keeps the world going rather than in what can end it. And my question therefore would be, I mean, how do you find that kind of connection between the specific reality that you are analyzing in Nigeria and this broader global Black critical reflection on suicide, and whether suicide can also be thought in terms of exit, but also escape or refusal, or if there is a non-merely nihilistic way of thinking of that.
I really like your question. So I said this the other day, one of the metaphors I keep thinking about when I think about like Black suicide, and I think about it in like the wider Black diaspora is the idea of the slave on the slave ship, who they might not be in control of the ship and where the ship is going, but they are in control of themselves, right? And they can assert their dignity in a very particular way. And one of the ways in which they chose to assert their dignity is to jump off that ship, is to say, I might not be in control of this ship, I'm in control of myself, I'm in control of my personhood, and I refuse to be treated in the way that I'm being treated right now, or I refuse to condemn myself to whatever this opaque future is, and therefore I'm jumping off this boat, And I think that to me, yes, that of course that is an exit. I think that that's a very powerful, like affirming act of like your dignity and your personhood, right? So I do think that suicide in Black communities historically has been operationalized in ways that are not just as simple as I'm depressed, I'm sad, I want to leave this world, but once again, how can I affirm my presence in this world in the only way that I have available to me, or I think that I have available to me.
Okay, we'll take a couple questions this time.
Well, I think I was just about to say this, which she said, which is the example of the slave ship. And my name is Roger Rock. I'm Roger Rock from Lafayette College, and both presentations are fascinating in different ways. The last one, the second one, I thought opens up this question of the expectations we have that institutions will do some work of care. And rarely, although we have long histories, and I think the panel in the morning kind of articulated that the idea that democracy fails actually more often than it succeeds. And yet we keep on with this expectation that by crafting institutions in particular ways, the outcome will be about delivering care. And this second presentation tells us that most of the institutions that are charged with the duty of care often spectacularly fail. And the example she describes in Peru is very common everywhere. And recently in South Africa during the corona pandemic, we had a spectacular display of that, where the institutions in charge of care neglected people and they died. And I wonder to push the second presenter to think much more broadly about this question of the expectation of care, being very core to how we think about institutions, and the reality of failure, which is a very I would say predominant ethnographic reality, and to envisage or think about the kinds of vital acts that are, because in this instance, the vital act is a kind of reparative act, so to speak. And she, in answering his question, she says that the institution did not take notice of that. So the repair work is only for the individual, the institution remains unchanged, and the next set of inhabitants of that space will endure the same kind of outcomes potentially. The first presentation I thought was also so interesting and powerful, precisely because it opens up a whole archive of I don't want to call it resilience, but surviving maybe, and when you were talking, I thought about the Lakey incident and I immediately thought about the slave jumping off the ship. Precisely because also during the Lakey moment, many people jumped into the river, the lagoon, as a way of escaping what looked like imminent death from the military squad that was there. And jumping, in the act of jumping, there is an act of hope. And I only asked for the microphone in order to address Franco. Right, so that in jumping, in taking the risk of suicide, there is an act of hope in it that I'm jumping in something that I don't know, but there is a possibility I may make it out on the other end. I don't know in the case of Lakey whether some people survived. Apparently some did, but many died also. So I thought that these were two interesting presentations, opening up interesting things in different ways. Thanks.
We're gonna take two more questions before I'll answer.
Thank you. My name is Ebuka Ifeanyichukwu from University of Delaware. And I related so very well with your presentation because precisely I was in Lakey during the protest. Yes, and my question to you is, in circumstances when we're back home or generally in Africa, suicide is sometimes framed as an act of cowardice. But in this context, is also you present as an act of resilience with regards to the circumstances and also the students in terms of an exit when someone is frustrated. So in circumstances where, because of the way the culture sometimes frames things, like I have witnessed circumstances where somebody jumped over the bridge and people were like, the stories that followed it was like, this is un-African. We only get to hear about this in America or in Western countries. So how do you juxtapose these two way of seeing suicide? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for your excellent presentations. I had a question for Ione, and really building off, I think, the previous questions. So you used this almost a way of framing an allegory looking at the slave ship. And so my question is really if you can push that a little bit further, because scholars writing on the Black Atlantic and the Middle Passage have also talked about the ocean sort of scientifically and metabolically as also the trace elements of people or things or plant life in general remains in the oceans for many, many, many years afterwards. And so I'm curious if you push this framing more, how do you then relate to the afterlives of suicide? And the way of framing it, how do you think of the afterlives then? If do you see these as trace? So and sort of, if you I don't know if you did you understand or did I explain it well enough?
Love a little bit more elucidation.
Well, so they write basically. So if you're talking about slave ships and you're looking at then the ocean today, it still contains the trace elements of all the people, for example, who died during this terrible, the Middle Passage, basically. So I think I'm just thinking about that. So today, the ocean, if you take like a bottle or beaker of water, that actually these still exist. So how do you think about then the present existence or the afterlives of then all the suicides that you're talking about? How do people continue afterwards? How do families live on? So in that sense, however you read afterlives, as in just because you talked about this framing, I think it would be so interesting to push that further. So.
One last question.
Thank you. When Rogers was speaking now about the institutions of care, how they feel, it just reminds me of what we call Department of Corrections here. It's just a very fantastic oxymoron. So, so which is, true of that, I think Martina's case in terms of how institutions, care, which in many ways are supposed to be one of the greatest symbols of what it means to be a citizen. Because as someone says, citizenship is about care, concern, and commitment. And so when you have those institutions that are set up to be able to care for people who are facing certain kinds of challenges in life or at certain stages of their life and they fail, which links to the question that was raised by Malik about the ways in which the neoliberal movement leads to the creation of institutions that are supposed to be symbolic of certain kinds of care, but are not supposed to actually deliver on the promise of care. But my question is about what I see as some kind of paradox in the two presentations were linked to the point that I think Anderson made in the morning about people refusing to be victims. And I think, it's paradoxical in that we have all these institutions and processes and, even persons who involved in these processes who victimize, people in those conditions. Yet, those people are not supposed to be victims. Now, it's also interesting that neoliberal language actually saying that people should not claim victimhood is the way by which neoliberalism actually performs its effect on us. You say, when you claim, when you complain about the effect of the structural process on your life, you are claiming victimhood. Even if you are surrendering your agency, even when you can see that those structural processes are victimizing people. So it's a paradox in that you're not supposed to claim, you're not supposed to be a victim, even when you are suffering the processes of. So the paradox there is that one, we can claim agency by refusing to be victims, but also it's important, perhaps ontologically, to recognize the structural victimization of which people are suffering. So it's really very challenging, especially as these two examples show, where people actually suffer those consequences, and the ways of claiming dignity is to refuse to be victims, even while we can recognize that they are being victimized.
Okay. Magdalena, you can begin to respond.
Yes, I think you're right. I'm talking to the third participant that made a comment. Neoliberalism has shown us that institutions don't care for people most of the time. In Peru, these institutions are places where people don't pay. So if you want care, if you want quality of life, if you want a dignified life to be offered to you, you have to pay a lot of money. But the case of my interlocutors is interesting because even when they have almost nothing, they, as you say, they refuse to be victims, and they execute their agency to live decent lives, even when everything is against them, even when the system is against them, the infrastructure is against them, and everything is against them. So I think there's a value there, like I am taking responsibility for myself because this place is not going to be responsible for me. But at the same time, that also goes hand to hand with the neoliberal premise that everyone is responsible for their own care and their own well-being, right? So it's like a complicated territory. But I would say that I agree with you that people for sure are not allowing themselves to be pictured or being seen as victims, and are rather executing acts that allow them to transcend and to be who they really are, to have a dignified life.
So yeah, I guess I'll work backwards. So thank you for your question, Malik. Sorry, I'm really bad at.
Okay, it's fine.
So when I think about the refusal to be seen as victims, I think of actually two of my different interlocutors. So I had one very interesting interview with a PhD student called Trent. And what was so interesting about it is that he was so aware that everyone around him was depressed, but he was not depressed. So with every sentence he said, he would follow it this way: they're depressed, I'm not depressed. But he would be getting increasingly more distressed as he spoke, you know? And I thought it was really interesting because he could understand so saliently that everyone around him was a victim, but he was also acutely aware of that even if he understood that, he shouldn't claim to be a victim himself, right? And that went hand in hand with a lot of the men who would say things like, I cry secretly. There's an immense shame. I cry secretly. I don't tell my family. I don't tell my friends that I cry, even telling me, even they're saying, can I confess to you? But well, you've just told me you're a drug addict. But so, I mean, why? That's okay. But I cry secretly. That's the shame, So I think it's a refusal to be seen as a victim, but it's also a knowledge that even if you do understand yourself as a victim, you should never admit that you're a victim, and you have to hide your understanding of victimhood. Then the idea of the allegory of the ocean. So that's such a beautiful, actually a very poetic question, and I thank you for it. And I have to think about it more, but one of the things I kept thinking about during your question was the idea of Mami water. I don't know if everyone is familiar with Mami water, right? And this is like this belief around Mami water. It emerges around slavery, right? And it emerges with the idea of people disappearing into the ocean, and kind of how the people remaining in Africa, in West Africa, kind of try and cope with the fact that they've disappeared. And so they invent this, I shouldn't say invent, they create this spiritual, this religious mythos around it, right? That is both comforting and gives them strength, And so I definitely think when I'm thinking about the aftermath of like slavery, and I have suicide and all these type of things, I'm also thinking about like what is the mythology potentially that is created by the people around them to help them understand this disappearance into this ocean, or this disappearance from this, this temporal plane. I don't know if that answer in any way makes sense, but what I kept thinking about during your question. And then the idea of like suicide being considered like an act of cowardice, un-African. This is such a, when I first embarked on my research, one of the things that a couple of people told me is, maybe they're not going to tell you about their mental health issues because, in general, mental health is so taboo in that most African context. Before we even say taboo to jump, or taboo to commit, it's taboo to say you're anxious, it's taboo to say you're depressed, but I don't think that these are contradictions. That's because just because a society says that something is taboo does not mean that the society does not practice this, right? The other day I had an interesting conversation with him about how like suicide is culturally differentiated. How an African will commit suicide is different from how a European will commit suicide, or how a Japanese person will commit suicide. So just because a society says something isn't taboo, says something is taboo, doesn't mean that there's not a culturally or societal language about how those actions are committed and why those actions are committed, right? But having said that, once again, my interlocutors understood that shame. I had interlocutors who talked about how instead of cutting their wrists, they cut the bottoms of their feet or things like that, so that, it's not understood that they're harming themselves. But I don't think there's a contradiction between what they're doing and this idea of un-Africanness, right? If anything, I think in some ways, when you look at it, and I've kind of spoken about the slave ship, I think there's a very African story of suicide, and that we can find instances throughout African history, both in the continent and on the diaspora, for Africans choosing suicide for a very particular reason that I think is unique to the Black experience and unique to the African experience. And then the idea of the act of hope, I really like that. I think that's very poetic and beautiful, and I think it's true. I think hope that you might be able to leave this to escape on earth. But I also just think the idea of hope of like, I am so exhausted and scared and tired of all these things in life, and I just hope that like if I jump into this, I don't know what's going to happen, but I just hope that whatever happens, I'm not going to feel those things anymore. And I think that's also a very hopeful way of looking at it. And yeah, I hope that I've tried my best to answer your questions, but I hope I have.
You did a very good job. I think both presenters did an excellent job. And one of the things that I think that we have to be mindful of, both of them were talking about, in terms of vital acts and in terms of suicide, individual examples of agency. But the fact that they are researching scholarship they're making it a communal act. Because they're getting this information out to people who may be inspired to organize around these issues. And I think that's the beauty and power of scholarship. Even when we talk about suicide, Africans on the slave ship, I'm still inspired by it, right? That form of resistance that people did. So we have to be mindful of that. So let us please thank Magdalene and Ione for their. Okay.
So housekeeping, I've just been informed that since we are dealing with the concept of instability, that lunch is not available.
I smell it, so that's not true.
Okay, so we're due for lunch. Thank you.